Below him is his niece, a very naughty Spencer girl called Lady Caroline Lamb. She's famous in history because she was a rather difficult to shake off mistress of Lord Byron, the poet. And then beneath is another portrait of that girl, Georgiana, the one I mentioned earlier, who had the gambling habit but was very interesting in her own right. There is a sort of tradition in my family of the women doing good works, I guess, or charity as we would call it now. And the first Earl Spencer, up the top left there, was very fortunately one of the sort of most privileged men in England. And his wife, that's his wife below, as a widow. He actually died quite young and left his wife as a widow. And she gave up this life of unbelievable extravagance and dedicated herself to good work. She moved to a much, much smaller house in St Albans. And she pioneered things that hadn't really happened among women of privilege before, such as prison visiting, looking after the elderly in the community, Sunday schools and things like that. So she managed to transfer from being overly privileged to giving a lot back. You'll see a lot of more recent family portraits there. That's my mother in the middle on that wall in the oval frame, and then my three sisters, Diana on the left there, and the two smaller portraits down the end. The one in uniform, that's my father, who was decorated on D-Day, invading Normandy. And again, that's him on the right as a small boy. And up until about 2 weeks ago, they were the only portraits I had of my father. And I'm very pleased to say that 2 weeks ago I managed to finally get one done, over 20 years after he died, in fact, by a very good artist. And we'll see that in a moment. It really is stunningly good. I was always nervous. I didn't think you could do that. But there is one artist in Britain who specialises in working from photographs and from learning about the people he's doing. So if we wander down this way past the Christmas tree, there's my grandfather. He was wounded in the First World War, and my grandmother, Cynthia Spencer, who the hospice is named after, looking very glamorous in 1919.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I know.
So you can just see the cricket pitch pavilion, and then beyond you can see the herd of black fallow deer. I've just introduced a new herd as well of red deer. Absolutely massive. They're from New Zealand actually. And you'll see them at some stage come down. The stag is the biggest stag I've ever seen. And he's got 9 wives. I don't know if any of you have been to Holcombe in Norfolk. It's a big estate there which is open to the public. And they're the ones who bred these red deer. And it's quite interesting because they had 3 massive red stags. And then they said that they'd sell the third one to us as one we got. And then very sadly, the other 2, I think there must have been a balance of power where they didn't attack each other. Your main bedrooms were on the ground floor and your main reception rooms were upstairs. And this was the family's, as I say, principal bedroom. And what I loved, when I took over, this was a bit of a blank canvas. It was a very strange room, wasn't really used. And I just thought, well, the little boy we met earlier, with his hand in the sash, who went on to have a very good political career, his real love was farming. And he didn't leave any art to this collection at all, except these paintings of his favourite bulls. And I thought, well, he was here for a fair amount of time, and we ought to look after them. And I found them, they're quite battered, some of them, a lot of them without frames. And so I had them sort of put back together. And I did research, because of course they look ridiculous. They look like cartoon animals. But they really did look like this. They were bred to be massive. And these were his prize ones. And in fact, that one, the Durham ox, was the champion bull of England. And then the Nottinghamshire collection comes in now. Where is that gentleman? There we are, yes. So what happened was that same man inherited this estate when it was really up against it financially. So his father had blown a fortune putting together the best private library in Europe. And I'm afraid a lot of the book dealers in London ripped him off. They used to conspire together to get ridiculous prices off him, and he just paid because he believed that was the right price. Anyway, the last 8 rooms we've walked through, he turned into libraries for his 43,000 first editions. He had 3 original works by Shakespeare, 57 Caxton Bibles, they're the first printed Bibles from England, and a host of other really, really precious things, but they weren't worth what he had paid for them. But his son, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer, that little boy with the hand in his sash, said, "Don't worry, you just carry on, I'll put it right." And so he decided 2 things. One was he would keep together the Northamptonshire estate and the other core land that my family had. But he'd get rid of bits that didn't matter. And he looked on the map and he said, well, I'll get rid of those 3 little bits near Surrey, I'll get rid of. They were tiny little villages. They're now Battersea, Wandsworth and Wimbledon. There were 20 houses each then. And the railway came through, and that was when they became sort of part of London. But on the other hand, he also decided that he had to marry an heiress, and it was a lady from Nottinghamshire. And she was called Esther Acklam from Wiston. And she was the sort of Kim Kardashian of her day, a less likely match from this sort of plodding country boy and this feisty, very, very rich woman you couldn't imagine. But when his family said, look, it's a really good idea and it's all organised if you just say the word, he went for a walk all the way around the park and he came back and said, yes, I'll marry her. And extraordinarily, they actually had a really happy marriage. But then very sadly, she died in childbirth, as did the baby. And he then was basically living here in mourning. He was doing his public service in London and then coming back here. And he just didn't want any fuss about him. And he got rid of everyone apart from one member of staff to look after him. So he lived a rather sort of sad life here, really. But then going back to the wider context of the family, these 2 chandeliers are my favourite in the whole collection. And those of you who like Waterford crystal, this is original Waterford glass from 1800. And they were from the man with the red beard shooting on Wimbledon Common, ended up ruling Ireland for Queen Victoria for 6 years. And he had these made for Dublin Castle when he was there, and then brought them back here. In fact, the forerunners of the IRA tried to murder him. As you saw, his very impressive red beard. He had a young cousin who came to work for him and thought it would be nice and flattering for his uncle to have the same red beard. But unfortunately, that ended in his demise because the forerunners of the IRA killed him in Phoenix Park. I've mentioned before this Duke of Marlborough, the ancestor of mine who beat the French 300 years ago. This screen in the corner was given to him by one of his allies, who was the Emperor of Austria. On the top, you'll see the Habsburg crest everywhere. But it's quite an interesting tale here, because the Emperor of Austria wanted this screen to be done in the best place in the world for it, and that was in China. But he also wanted to commemorate the Duke of Marlborough's victories in Europe. So he carefully sent across the muskets that the men had used and all the uniforms so that the Chinese could reproduce them perfectly. But what was interesting was the Chinese workmen who did this screen had never seen a European person. So all of the soldiers, all of Marlborough's English soldiers had Chinese features because they just assumed. And I've done more research into this, and apparently it was really dangerous. If you sent off, it could take 7 years to send off your design. You wanted a new set of china made for your household. And it would end in disaster quite often because the Chinese workmen obviously couldn't read English. So you get your lovely plate back and there'd be an arrow on it saying, paint this bit gold. And it was just, you just had to throw them away. Anyway, we'll go have a look at other china now. I don't know much about China, so this is going to be a brief part of the talk. So this is known as the China Museum, and what it is a way of showing just a sort of selection of the wider collections. And there is without doubt somebody in this room who knows a lot more about China than me, probably all of you, so I'm really going to struggle here. So I do know that blue and white is Sèvres, and there's, yes, I know that, there's Meissen and there's Stone, there's Chelsea, there's all the different things you would expect. But actually there's only a photograph at the moment, just behind in that cabinet there, of the most interesting set, because it's being lent to a museum at the moment. And it's this absolutely beautiful set. It's called a chocolate service, and it was a little hot chocolate pot, cup, milk, sugar, and it was the personal property of Queen Marie Antoinette of France. And she would have that served to her in the morning, before coffee became particularly popular. And the reason it came to my family was because after the French Revolution, the French were destroying everything royal and aristocratic, and my family sent over a priest to try and retrieve a few things before they were destroyed, and that was the most interesting piece. Now, 100 years ago, in fact in 1913, my family received the great privilege of a royal visit. It was George V and Queen Mary, but Queen Mary was the house guest from hell. And we have a very interesting piece in the cabinet there, which is a green vase about 3 up with a picture of Spencer House on it. The reason that is so unusual, I'll explain to you. So when you had Queen Mary to visit, she had this unerring habit of hinting. So you'd be sitting down and you'd have your best tea set out, and she'd go, "I really like the teapot." And the hostess would nervously go, "Well, yes, it's been in the family for many generations." And she'd go, "I really like it." So she'd take things. She was a complete thief. And what's unusual about this is that she actually gave that to my family. Because it had a painting of Spencer House on it, she brought it as a house gift, and there aren't many of them around. She was a magpie, basically. We're now going to walk past. You'll see a series of medals on the right. I had a great uncle who was a war hero in the First World War in the Navy, and a lot of those medals are his. But then we'll get to the staircase. The lady who is finding walking slightly complicated, take your time coming up the stairs. There's no hurry, or sit it out, whichever you want to do. The stairs are a little sort of old, so you're best going one side or the other just because they're less wobbly. It's a beautiful tree. That brother is very artistic, and his boyfriend was here for a week, making it all look perfect. So it's family. It's quite nice.
Done a very good job.
Yes.
Does he know exactly how many baubles are on the tree?
Well, I know that he had the gardeners doing it, and they said, "This is more than we've ever done." And he said, "Yes, but it's going to be better than we've ever had." So, to give you your bearings, we started through the open doors. That's the entrance hall. We've done a bit of a loop around the ground floor, and we're now in what is called the saloon. Your saloon was your sort of central hallway, I guess. And I mentioned right at the beginning, this would have been an open courtyard. You'd have got out of your carriage or off your horse on the bottom bit. And I can just give you, I'm afraid there's an organ moved in because we've got a carol service in here tomorrow night. Being conducted by the Reverend Richard Coles, who was in the Communards, if any of you remember the Communards from the 1980s. Anyway, he's quite musical. And anyway, so I'm just going to give you the real basic piece of family history. I'm not going to bore you with it. But a lot of you will know that Winston Churchill's actual surname wasn't Churchill, it was Spencer-Churchill. And I'm just going to explain why that is. The man in the middle, in the red tunic, with the crown above his frame, that's John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, and he's the one I've referred to a couple of times. He, I guess, along with Wellington, is one of the 2 greatest soldiers England's ever had. And he managed to defeat Louis XIV of France in the early 1700s. And Louis hadn't been defeated in his entire 60-year reign before that. And as a thank you, he was given Blenheim Palace, built from scratch in the 1700s. And he was very unfortunate. He had two sons who predeceased him. And because he was so newly a sort of hero of this country, there was a special act of Parliament that said that the title of Duke of Marlborough was allowed to go through the female line. And this is a time of high mortality, of course. I mean, your average life expectancy in 1700 as an English person was 38. His eldest daughter died, her child died. So the second daughter, Anne, married my ancestor, who's called Charles Spencer. And Charles Spencer had two sons. The eldest Spencers, so that they're exactly our family, got Blenheim, and the younger ones stayed here. And then what happened with the first Duke of Marlborough, when he died, his wife, who was called Sarah, the first Duchess of Marlborough, was incredible. In her own right, think back 300 years, she was a feminist. And she decided that she had to have her own money, and she was absolutely ruthless about it. By the time she died in 1744, she had got 27 large landed estates around England and huge political power. There was a time when the Bank of England was short of money, and she lent them money. She was that rich. She was absolutely impossible to deal with day to day. And in fact, in the last year of her life, she rewrote her will 25 times. But very luckily for this house, the favourite grandson, who she left everything to, is the man in the green jacket over the fireplace next to the boy on the horse. He's called John Spencer. And the reason she didn't fall out with him, she fell out with everyone else, was because he never bothered to argue with her. He was absolutely charming and useless. And she actually said to him, "I'm going to make you a very, very wealthy man, and you have to get married." And he said, "Yeah, I'll get married." And he said, "But who to?" And she gave him a list of the suitable women from London. And he married the Rubens of the Holy Land, probably one of the prettiest portraits.
Lovely, yeah.
It's amazing.
So I mentioned earlier that all the functions of the room have changed over the generations, and this would have been a sort of waiting room. If you were coming to visit a family or whatever, this is where you'd have waited before they were ready. Quite interesting in here, the most interesting thing to me, is that the 6 paintings either side of the main portrait over the fireplace are actually, they were never meant to be framed. They were never meant to be hung on a wall. They're actually copper panels that were on a piece of wooden furniture, a long forgotten piece of furniture. I don't know if it burnt or rotted or whatever, but those are panels rather than paintings. And then otherwise we've got, that's the first Duke of Marlborough, top left there. That's one of his more sort of famous portraits, I guess. And then over the main one, the lady with a floral garland around her. There's sort of a lot of children, so this is all in adult code. She was very popular in her day, and each of those flowers represents one of her gentleman admirers. She was quite proud of it.
see the wallpaper above it?
Sorry.
This is called the great room, and your great room traditionally would have been your main reception room. I use it today for meetings and occasional dinners and etc. conferences we do here, etc. So that's why the table's there. But if you can imagine it as a very grand sitting room, it's where you put some of your best paintings, etc. I've mentioned Spencer House earlier. Now, Spencer House was built by the first Earl Spencer as a love token for his wife. So I don't know how many of you believe in ghosts, and I certainly have never seen one, but I will tell you a quite bizarre story, which is true, from this room, from about 17 years ago. One of the things I do with my life is write really turgid history books, and I was doing a history of my family, and there's a muniment room, which is a sort of family record room. It goes all the way back. You can see what they ate in 1500 and what they bought, etc. And there was this leather volume, and it had press cuttings from the 18th century to do with this house and this family. And I was so interested in this particular one, I just happened to open it, and it was a new story to me, and it was a newspaper story about a bishop staying in this bed in the 1850s. And he came down to breakfast the next day, and he said to my family, I know it's quite eccentric, but I actually like sleeping with a candle next to my bed, burning throughout the night. And could you please ask the man who came in and blew it out last night not to do so again? So that was the story, because basically my family said, well, nobody did it. And when the bishop described the man, it was the groom of the house whose job it had been to go through all the rooms at night and snuff out candles, but he'd been dead 30 years. So that's what the newspaper had settled on. And this was on a Friday evening. I had a friend of mine and his new girlfriend come and stay here that same day for a cricket match. And then on the Sunday, I was helping them down with their suitcases. And the girl, who I'd never met before that weekend, said to me, do you know a man came in here last night with a candle? And he was wearing a long cloak. And I thought, goodness, I suppose there's a 1 in a million chance she found the key to the muniment room. There's a 1 in a billion chance she found the volume with that passage in it. So I went into the attic and I brought down a footman's cloak, which is very similar except around the bottom. And nobody would know that apart from me, because I'm a bit of a history nerd. And she said, well, it was very like that, except it had more of a bit around the bottom. And it was the most extraordinary thing. And how I've come to terms with this story, because it is true, is I think that houses like this, or places of ancient history, have an energy in them. And I think you can resurrect energy by just a moment like that, and somehow his spirit came back, not in a creepy way, but just somehow. On a less ghostly note, this is actually a room where a secret wedding took place. So we've seen the little boy on the horse above the fireplace in the saloon, and he was the first Earl Spencer. His father died when he was a little boy, and he was left with a big inheritance, but he wasn't able to touch it or have his own life until he got to be 21. That was the convention in those days. And so he planned a massive 21st birthday party up here. He brought in chefs from France, and a huge amount of people came up for the wedding, and they camped all over the park. In fact, when the party of guests got from London to St Albans, the people of St Albans rang the church bells because they thought it was an invading army. There were so many. So this is a really beautiful view out this side. In fact, in the First World War, army officers used this bit as a polo ground. And then, if we go further back, this actual bit of garden out here was a lawn bowling, a green for lawn bowls. And our most famous user of this green was Charles I, who's top right out of this collection of 6 paintings. So Charles I came here as an honoured guest in the 1630s, and the people of Northamptonshire came to see him. There's a big banquet here in this room. They had a massive table down the centre, and for the king they had a banquet of things that we don't eat anymore really, peacocks and swans and herons. And I've always been slightly intrigued by the idea of eating a heron, because it doesn't spring to mind as something you'd want to eat. But then I looked into it, and apparently what they used to do, there was a wood at the back of the park called the heronry, and they used to breed herons there. And then in the spring, the gamekeepers would shin up the trees and get some of the young herons out of the nests, and then bring them down to the big house. And there was a lady who lived in the backyard, who one of her duties was to plump up these herons, but also to try and get rid of the fishy taste, because they'd have been fed by their mothers already with fish. And she did this by feeding them porridge and chopped bullock liver. You'd have thought it'd just be easier to find a bird that hadn't eaten fish, but this is what they did, and this was a great delicacy, and you can imagine Charles I and his court eating that in this room. And when they had this banquet, I mean, they ate all these perch and trout and all sorts of things. So this is another painting by Van Dyck, this lady who has passed away. This is so unfortunate. It's a love story that's gone very wrong. She's called Lady Venetia Digby, and she was married to this cheery-looking chap down the bottom left in the black and white top. And she was not feeling well one day, and he thought, this is not a problem because I'm actually a brilliant chemist. And he concocted her a medicine to make her better, but unfortunately he didn't realise that mercury wasn't a good thing to have in it, and she sadly passed away. This is also a Van Dyck. This lady on top right is one of Van Dyck's, it's his mistress, a woman with the unfortunate name of Margaret Lemon. And then underneath is this wonderful portrait. So I think this is my favourite in the house. This is of Sarah Marlborough, the one we met who cut her hair off, who was the great sort of benefactor of his family. And this is so modern and startling, and I think, we have no proof of this, but I think he did this because he had to paint her so many times. In fact, this is one of her in middle age, but he had to paint her so many times. I think he kept this as a sort of working portrait of her face, because she was a very important and busy woman. She wouldn't have been able to sit for him the whole time, but that's why I think it wasn't necessarily completed. And then the great painting in this house is the one we sort of close with, and this is called War and Peace. And it's by Van Dyck. It's considered one of his greatest paintings. And the British government have a list of 10 items in Britain that are still in private hands that must never ever leave this country. So basically, if I or my son Louis, who's struggling with his exams downstairs, ever had to sell it, the government said, could they have first call? And the reason is, it's obviously very dramatic, but it captures a moment in British history with these two